Welcome back to the book log. Today I'm talking about Four Past Midnight, four novella collection by Stephen King. I'm reviewing a collection of four novellas, so I feel the need to have some qualifying remark about how it's weird to evaluate a selection of individual stories as one single aggregate product. But to be honest, it doesn't feel that weird in this case. I think the broader point is still true that these are all different stories and they all vary in quality, but I don't know, there's some unplaceable connection between them to me, something beyond the fact that they all are in the same collection. And I've been trying to figure out what it is. The closest I can get is that they all have to do with the blurring or the disintegration of reality somehow. I don't know, that seems too vague though. I'm not really sure how to explain it other than they just have similar vibes. So we'll just go with that. Another similarity between all of these four stories is that pretty much every single one of them I would say is too long. I think some are more too long than others, but probably every story here could stand to be trimmed by 30%. Probably this is the most glaring issue with the collection. It's just not concise at all. But despite that, I do still think that it's full of cool ideas and concepts, and it's got a lot of interesting characters. It's got a lot of unique set pieces. It's got a lot of very intriguing premises, but in all four stories, to varying degrees, I thought that it dragged at certain points. Stephen King, obviously no stranger to overwriting. In fact, he's kind of famous for this exact thing. The problem is that usually his long digressions and descriptions are still kind of interesting or are at the very least endearing to me personally. In Four Past Midnight, it didn't always come across that way. The length sometimes didn't feel warranted. Again, I didn't hate these stories. I still like them. I guess I'm just kind of venting because it took me forever to read this thing. Look at this. Come on. I mean, this is four novellas. This is a 1,000-page book. Anyways, I'm just going to talk about all four stories in chronological order, and then maybe at the end I'll rank them or something. But the collection starts off very strong with the first story here, which is The Langoliers. I think this is handily the best story in the collection. It's about a group of people who wake up in the middle of a commercial flight across the country only to realize that the majority of the passengers and the entire crew have simply disappeared. Luckily, the protagonist, Brian Engel, is a pilot, so he's able to kind of commandeer the flight and land them safely. But then when they exit the plane, it seems that everyone in the world has disappeared. The airport is completely devoid of life, and then on top of that, a bunch of other weird stuff starts happening, colors and sounds and textures and tastes all begin to dull, and there are some strange encroaching, gnashing sounds in the distance. And it turns out that the plane flew through some type of time warp, and all the passengers have found themselves separated from time. The empty world that they find themselves in is actually a version of reality that is just a few minutes in the past. So they're inhabiting a world that time has already moved on from, so to speak. So when the past becomes the present, the past version of the world is still just sitting there vacant, waiting to be destroyed. And that's where the Langoliers come in. They are the creatures that destroy the past world once time is no longer happening there. As creatures, they're kind of silly. They're just these little balls that zip around eating reality. But in essence, they are pretty terrifying. Their sole purpose is to destroy the physical dimension of the past. Conceptually, I thought this story was fantastic. It's so weird and creepy and unsettling and mysterious. And I think the answer to these riddles that Stephen King comes up with is equally compelling. The idea that every single moment exists separately from the forward progression of time, and these characters are just stuck outside of it. Super fascinating. Is it too long still? Yeah, probably. And some of the characters are kind of goofy, and a lot of the interpersonal drama going on between all the cool concepts didn't interest me that much. But all in all, I thought the story was quite good. Again, I think this was my favorite story in the collection. The next story is Secret Window, Secret Garden. In some ways, this is a classic Stephen King story. It's about a writer, contains a lot of meta commentary on the art of writing itself. In the case of this story, it's about a writer named Morton Rainey who, in the opening scene of the story, is immediately accused of plagiarism by this man named John Shooter. There is a particular short story Mort has that's called Sowing Season, and John Shooter is claiming that it is a ripoff of his own, much less successful story called secret window, secret garden. Mort vehemently denies these allegations, and the majority of the first part of the story revolves around him trying to locate an original version of the magazine the story was first published in order to prove that he wrote it 2 years before John Shooter claims to have written his own story. Unfortunately, Shooter also happens to be somewhat of a psychopath, and the following night he murders Mort's cat, allegedly burns down the house of Mort's ex-wife, where Mort also used to live, and also where a copy of that magazine would have been located. I think the first section of the story is very successfully frustrating. You can really keenly sense the feeling of like injustice that King is trying to evoke with this fraudulent plagiarism accusation, and Shooter just comes off as such an annoying and hateable villain. Pretty quickly into the story though, it transitions into something completely different. It's slowly revealed that Shooter is actually not real. He is instead a split personality of Mort himself, and more or less like a manifestation of this guilt Mort feels over actually plagiarizing a story when he was an undergrad in college. It was Mort who killed his own cat, as well as 2 other people. It was him who burned down his own house. He was never caught when he plagiarized that story in college, and I guess his subconscious guilt broke through and eventually led to this psychological snap. This revelation is written to be like a twist ending, but it was so heavily foreshadowed throughout the story that I caught on relatively early, I would say, which kind of made it anticlimactic. It was just a little too slow and a little too obvious. I thought the plagiarism angle was interesting, but the whole split personality deal was too drawn out, too similar to The Dark Half, which was, hot take, a book I didn't like that much in the first place. I think this story is actually better than The Dark Half, to be fair, but just still not something that fully cohered into anything truly great for me. Next up in line, we have The Library Policeman. This is probably my second favorite story in the collection, personally, but I wouldn't like bat an eye at anyone who says that they hate it. It's a very viscerally upsetting story, and while I think it earns the ability to go the places it goes, it's definitely like walking a fine line. There's a lot going on in the plot, but the gist of it is that there's this guy named Sam Peebles who borrows a couple library books to help liven up a speech he has to give to his local Rotary Club. The library itself is strange and creepy, and so is the librarian, Ardelia Lortz, who is unnervingly threatening when it comes to like turning in the library books on time. And then from here, the story essentially splits off into 2 separate branches. In one, you have the revelation that Ardelia is some sort of malevolent vampire monster that feeds off fear, very It. And the other is the revelation that Sam has repressed the horrifying trauma of being violently raped as a child near his hometown library. There's a scene in the story which depicts this event very vividly and very thoroughly, which many people find to be inappropriate and offensive. I thought the scene was at least justified in the sense that, you know, repressed trauma is the core theme of the story, and this is like the central event of the narrative. But again, I understand thinking that King takes it too far here. One of my main issues with the story is that those 2 separate plot lines didn't really like square in my head. The Ardelia monster stuff and the Sam trauma stuff just never like resolved in a way that made sense to me, especially given the nearly incomprehensible ending. That said, I do think the story itself is very effective. It has a very eerie, unsettling atmosphere. I think it's complemented very well by the rural Iowan backdrop. The characters also felt very authentic to me, almost the opposite of The Langoliers, where the plot and ideas were great, but the characters were a little flat. Again, this story was also definitely a bit long-winded. It could have been pared down, especially the super long, drawn-out Dirty Dave Duncan backstory, even though I did enjoy aspects of that. Overall, just like very solid, even if a little bit over the top. And more Stephen King books should be set in Iowa. Creepy place. I lived in Iowa before. Unsettling state. And then lastly, we have The Sundog, which is probably my least favorite story in the collection. It has some creepy moments, but overall it's kind of boring. It's too long, like everything else. It's just way too long. This one probably should have been a short story, honestly. It's so sparse for how long it is. The plot here is very simple. You got this kid, Kevin Delavan, who gets a Polaroid Sun 660 camera for his 15th birthday, and it turns out to have some sort of like supernatural defect. No matter what he points the camera at and takes a picture of in real life, the photo produced by the camera is always the same image of a strange, hostile-looking black dog standing near a white picket fence. And as Kevin continues to take photos, the dog appears to slowly move closer and closer to the frame. And that's essentially it. Like I said, the plot here is quite thin. The story's saving grace to me is the inclusion of the character Pop Merrill. This is a Castle Rock story, which is important to mention, I think, because Pop, even though he's not in other Castle Rock stories as a character, he is referenced a lot throughout the broader Castle Rock multiverse, and his presence and influence on the town is well documented, especially in a book like Needful Things. Pop is the uncle of Ace Merrill, a very iconic Stephen King villain, and even though that relationship is not really explored in the story, Ace isn't even in the story at all, you can connect the dots between the two characters. I just thought he was like a well fleshed out character. He can come off as like friendly and disarming, but he's got this cold, transactional, unscrupulous way that he views the world and interacts with people, and it has a certain dark tone to it that I thought was interesting. But again, like I said earlier, the story's just way too long for how little it has going on, and also the entire central concept doesn't really make sense to me. Like, this camera is taking pictures of an evil dog monster creature in some other reality within the world of the photograph, but I just don't get it. A lot of times Stephen King over-explains his monsters. In this story, it's kind of the opposite. I don't understand this dog's deal. What is the photo world it's in exactly? Why is it mad at Kevin / whoever's taking the photos? How is it using this camera to become born into the real world? And why does it want to be born in the first place? These are probably irrelevant questions. Not every monster needs some explicable backstory, but I just spent a lot of this story being like, what? It doesn't seem to be a thematic metaphor for anything. King is just literally like, hey, what if there was a creepy dog that was trying to escape through a photograph? And I suppose that's fine. It just didn't like resonate with me on any level deeper than that. So yeah, I think I'm just gonna wrap it up there. 4 Past Midnight. It's got a lot of great moments. I can give it that. Each of the 4 stories in here has at least some redeeming qualities, and I would go so far as to say that I enjoyed all of them to like some degree or another. But as I've said a bunch of times, they all suffer from the same thing, which is just they're overwritten. I think all 4 stories in here would have benefited from some additional editing, or possibly shorter story formats in general. When it's good, it's good. You know, Stephen King really kind of puts you to work in this collection. He's making you sift and dig for the worthwhile material, but it is in there. You just have to go find it yourself. I pretty much already gave away my ranking, but just to lay it out explicitly, I would say last place, Sundog, then Secret Window, Secret Garden, Library Policeman, The Langoliers. Overall, probably would give this collection like a solid 6.